When I was younger, I had the misfortune of knowing someone who I believe to this day is an actual and complete fucking psychopath. I'll just call him Frank. I met Frank in an after-school daycare in 2nd grade, and we were instantly friends. He was actually the only friend I ever had there. The owner was a shithead who encouraged kids to bully each other for entertainment. She's in jail now, so no other friends were made. 3 months later, in the summer between 2nd and 3rd grade, we had a field trip to the local pool, and Frank and I were just doing our thing. Then he just stops talking mid-sentence and stares out into the open. We were having a pretty mundane conversation too. I don't even remember what it was. A flash of rage crosses his face, subsiding to a calculating expression of premeditated violence. Fucking scary.tiff. Another flash of rage, and he punches me in the face. We were in the deep end, and old little me was pretty weak. He presses his thumbs into my larynx and holds me underwater. I remember holding my breath, kicking him, trying to move his arms away. And worse yet, I remember seeing his face through the ripples. I feel like he was just gazing down at me, blankly. His expression was so neutral that it must have looked like nothing was happening. 35 seconds. I couldn't hold it anymore. Then I remember more splashing, frantic, feet and fists flying around me. An older girl dragged me out of the water at the last second, while another boy my age wrestled Frank off of me. Frank fought back, and the other boy broke his nose. But the way it happened, it almost seemed like he was just letting it happen. Then Frank went to the lifeguards and the owner, bawling his eyes out. I saw pain, fear, regret, shame all on his face, pushing tears out with this anonymous weight. Or so I thought, for maybe a second. For just a moment, not even 4 seconds, there was no one looking at Frank. The lifeguards were seeing if I was okay. Any parents present had tuned the situation out almost immediately. The girl was off to the side defending her brother's actions, and the daycare lady had turned around to yell at him instead of consoling what she also thought were some genuine emotions on Frank's part. Literally the second that no one was seeing what he was doing, Frank's head was pointed at me. It was so frighteningly instantaneous that I was looking right at him and I didn't even see his head move. It wasn't there, and then it was there. No apparent motion in between. He was blank again. No emotions, no sobs, tears drying on his face. That look slowly turned back into the expression of calculation. Brows raised, chin up, sides of his mouth tense. The face of premeditated violence. I was so scared I started crying. And then, as the daycare lady began turning back towards him, before they should have even been able to see each other, he looked up at her and resumed his sobbing. Everyone believed his side of the story, that I had dared him to hold me underwater to scare the lifeguards. No one believed me, or the older girl, or the other boy. No one. It's been over 10 years, and there is still no one on this earth that I fear more than Frank, and nothing that I remember more clearly than that day. And the worst part is, I have more Frank stories, if anyone wants to hear them. That was just the first. Grade 4 was the next time I met Frank. He was in my class. I begged and begged the principal and the counselors, and just about anyone who would listen to me, to put me in a different class. Whenever I saw Frank, he was staring at my friend, who we shall call Jane. Every time she caught him staring, he didn't quickly look away, like any other 4th grade boy who was just discovering that, dames ain't so bad, you know? If anything, I think this was his version of a first crush. But he would never avert his gaze. No matter how many times she caught him, he would just keep staring. He would never stop until a few minutes after she would try to make him stop. I remember during recess one day, He walked up to her and I and asked to speak to her alone. Some of her bratty little girlfriends heard this and made their usual "ooh," which is a descendant and yet polar opposite of "ew, boys have cooties." So she felt pressure to go and talk to him. Jane's friends walked away and I just stood there, watching them. Frank whispered something in Jane's ears, and she looked terrified. She stood there, tears in her eyes and total shock on her face. Frank stepped towards her, pushing his chest out and looking angrily down his nose at her. Her feet were glued to the ground, and she was just staring back at him, seemingly afraid to break eye contact, sobbing quietly and looking terrified. I couldn't move either. I was too shocked by what I saw to step in. After a full 30 seconds of this, he smiled and bade her a polite "bye-bye." He walked away, and she ran towards me, burying her face into my shoulder and sobbing, which is the first time I ever touched a girl while repulsing in horror because, well, you know, elementary school. She wouldn't tell me what he said. She didn't speak to any other students for the next 5 days. Then she was moved to a different school, and my wish to change classes was abruptly granted. I had no Frank to worry about. I still saw Frank around the school and whatnot, but it was years before he paid me any attention again. He had plenty of friends by 5th grade, and he was all smiley and nice and acting normal. And so, at the time, I thought he was fine. Jane, on the other hand, I was always suspicious, always worried about what had become of her. The next time I saw Jane was a full 7 years later, in 11th grade. She didn't look anorexic or anything, but she was so small and delicate. I talked to her for a few hours, and we caught up with each other on everything that happened since then. Mostly, she had a nervous frown on her face, avoiding eye contact and speaking softly. She looked down, striking her hand across her opposite shoulder whenever she spoke. A couple times, I would put my hand on her shoulder, or I said just the right thing, and she would smile and chuckle a little bit. There was a lot of small talk, but we also told each other where we had been since grade 4. I stayed in the same town, same school system this entire time. She always missed her friends here, and the day that Frank died, she and her parents started making plans to return. She had taken the rest of grade 4 off, and it took months for her therapist to get her to repeat Frank's words. She still won't tell me what he said. That was the only time she ever repeated it. She was homeschooled in grade 5 and 6 on the other side of the province. And after that, she went to a normal school and had some normal times. To this day, she is incredibly timid, except for a few moments we've had, but still very happy and stable. The only lapses in her mental stability seemed to be when someone mentioned Frank, or psychopaths in general. And, worryingly enough, rape. Then she gets paranoid and stays that way for a few days. Not even Frank's violent demise stopped her from having one more encounter with him. But if I'm going to say more, I'm going to tell the stories in order. So, that comes later. In grades 5 and 6, I didn't pay much attention to Frank. Everything I remember him doing in that period was pretty normal. He went everywhere on a bicycle, had his first girlfriend. I think he was on a soccer team or something. I didn't talk to him, but he had plenty of friends, and seemed well adjusted. Maybe he just had little boy problems. I think we all remember 2 or 3 little boys with anger problems when they're little, that kind of just go away eventually. I totally thought that was the case with Frank. Then, enter grade 7. Frank was in my class again that year, and he kinda started to freak people out after a while. Every 7th grader wished to be a badass, but Frank would never shut up about knives and guns and porn. Everyone, including his friends and even teachers, started getting really scared of him again. Being fairly nice for a 12-year-old, I figured he just needed someone to spend time with. So, I volunteered some afternoons and we hung out a few times a month. He had a much better home life than I would have thought. His dad did die when he was little, but his mom was a lovely lady. After being a guest in our house, I could understand why the "your mom" jokes made Frank so angry. Things were good. Frank started seeming really well adjusted again in around January, and we had a bit of group of friends going. Things were good. Then, Frank started showing me things. He owned dozens of knives, hunting and combat and utility, all sorts. His mother didn't know about them. He started bringing them to school with him. I think I was the only person who knew. He would show only me during lunch every day. He would pull a different little one out of his pocket and say, "Just in case." I thought he was paranoid about other people. In March, tensions built between Frank and another boy, who we shall call Douche Canoe. I don't even remember what they were fighting about. It was whatever pisses off 13-year-old boys, I guess. I saw Frank giving Douche Canoe that blank stare. That one that I had forgotten. The one that I had feared. It was during class. Douche Canoe noticed and told Frank to stop. Frank didn't even blink. He sat and kept staring, just like he had done to Jane. Knowing that a fight was coming, and I've never been much of a fighter myself, I did the only thing I could do to help Douche Canoe. At the beginning of lunch break, when the fight was soon to go down, I picked Frank's pocket and threw his knife down a storm drain. Frank stared Douche Canoe down. Douche Canoe was terrified. Frank once again had the face of premeditated violence. I remember his shoulders looking broad and square under his old leather coat. Frank marched towards Douche Canoe with the same "I'm gonna rape you" body language that he used on Jane. Douche Canoe panicked and swung first. Frank moved so fast, it was like Douche Canoe's arm snapped itself. Frank drove his foot into Douche Canoe's jaw and tackled him to the ground. He reached for his pocket and found nothing. I'm glad I took the knife. I remember Frank's blank face throughout the whole thing. He looked bored as he pounded Douche Canoe's head into the dirt. The chanting and cheering stopped, and everyone just watched in silent horror. Frank alternated arms with his punches, and each one was exactly 1 second after the last. But each individual punch was frightening. He would raise a fist up behind his head and drive it into Douche Canoe's face in an imperceptible fraction of a second. I sure hope the teachers were doing something really fucking important that kept them from intervening for a whole 3 minutes. The kids who had gathered, including myself, were crying in empathy and fear for Douche Canoe as Frank stood up, faced the teacher, and said without blinking, smiling, frowning, or even the slightest movement of his eyebrows, "Call this boy an ambulance." Frank got a 10-day suspension. Douche Canoe got 2 months in the hospital. The scariest thing about Frank's demise is that it wasn't the last time Jane or I ever saw him. There's always a group of boys who do this in 8th grade. They start a gang, walking around their suburban town with untouched knives in their pockets, running around and hiding like criminals, when their only crime is occasional loitering. Every 8th grader wanted to be a badass. The difference with Frank is that while his friends grew out of it, Frank grew into it. Grade 10 is when high school starts in my province. And while it's a great school and a super fun time, it exposes you to the fact that even the quaintest little burbs aren't completely innocent. In fact, being as close to the mountains as we were, it made our town into quite the little cutesy drug highway. Frank became a drug dealer. The rumor to this day is that Frank never took any narcotics, not even once. The guy was fucking crazy on his own. I wasn't the best high schooler either, so I was with a client of his during a trade once. Frank did it the whole time. That stare. Maybe he was doing it on purpose, using his reputation to intimidate. Maybe he was just doing it. I don't know. There was even a rumor going around that he raped a girl. The last year of Frank's life was fairly shrouded in rumors. But there were a few that I didn't believe. This was one that I didn't need to believe, because he told me himself. I saw Frank the night before he died. It was the first time I had ever seen him afraid. We bumped into each other near a Tim Hortons and had a coffee and talked for a while. He didn't understand what he had done to people. He didn't understand why everyone was freaking out about the rumor that he, raped someone. We talked about her and Jane and Douche Canoe and countless other people that he had wronged. He just didn't get it. He called them cattle, sheep, human livestock. He didn't care. And he didn't understand why anyone else would. It's not like they're fucking important anyway. I tried to get up and leave. He put a firm hand on my shoulder and pulled me back onto my chair. Suddenly, and for the first time that I know, he looked afraid. Vulnerable, even. He explained to me that his boss lived in the nearby city and was a scary, powerful gangster. For reasons I don't know to this day, Frank and his boss had a falling out. The look trickled onto Frank's face. Eyebrows raised, chin up, sides of the mouth tensed. The face of malevolence. I had just gotten my driver's license, and Frank asked me to drive him into the city. Ordered me. I was afraid to say no. We didn't talk on the way there. The last time I ever saw Frank, he was pulling a pistol out of his coat. He told me to pull over. He got out and walked away. I drove away as quickly as I could. He must have stayed somewhere overnight. And the next day, there was a news report of a gunfight, but no known fatalities. A few days later, Frank's stepdad reported him missing. After a week of uncertainty, a body matched Frank's description was pulled out of a dumpster by a police officer, rotting and riddling with bullet holes and shrapnel. The scariest part? I lied when I said that was the last time I ever saw Frank. No, I'll tell you the end. I don't know if the mainstream media bothered with this, but the local news went crazy for weeks. The bodies of all sorts of gangsters started showing up dead out of nowhere. A body matching Frank's description had been found, but it was mutilated. Very few people know that he is in fact alive today, and Frank isn't his real name, so don't bother. My theory is that he spent the first day picking off his aggressors one by one, finishing by pitting the last few against some poor schmuck about the same height, weight, and hair color. But really, that's all conjecture on my part. I don't know how he did it. It's not like he would just have a twin lying around at his disposal. A year after graduating high school, Jane and I were at my apartment, catching up. I had cleaned up my act a lot since grade 10, and Jane had a fairly spotless act to begin with. She was so relaxed that day. The air of nervousness, the tension she carried around, was completely absent that day. She was as quiet as ever. I suppose she just had a small voice, but she wasn't timid. My buzzer went off. I can't explain how or why I felt so uneasy. I opened the door, Jane close on my heels, to see Frank turning to walk down the staircase. We saw him, but he didn't see us. I don't think he knows that we know that he's alive. Jane was silent with terror. I was shocked and angry, but I let that go when I knew that she needed some calming down. I don't know if it was a sick fucking joke or something, but if you read the first Frank story on this thread, this will almost disgust you. He left only 2 things on my doormat: a pair of water wings and a snorkel. I still haven't found a photo. I've been trying for years. Truth is, even his parents just want to forget him.